What's the creepiest, most unexplainable thing you've seen with your own eyes that still haunts you to this day? Story 1. My mom used to hide under my bed at night. I was born in 2000, grew up in a small town in northeast Ohio. We had one of those little ranch-style houses, all on one floor, 3 bedrooms. It was just me and my mom for most of my life. My dad left when I was a baby. She was a good mom, from what I remember. We didn't have much money, but she made sure I always had what I needed. She worked as a waitress at a restaurant in the center of town. Always tired, but always kind. We'd watch movies together at night. She'd tuck me in, kiss my forehead, and tell me she loved me. I felt safe. Except at bedtime. I must have been about 6 or 7 the first time I noticed it. One night after she tucked me in, I heard the floor creak after she turned off the light. Not out in the hall, right by my bed. I remember freezing, listening. Then I heard the sound of her breathing. Slow, heavy, right underneath me. I leaned over the edge and whispered, "Mom?" She didn't answer. Just this soft little giggle. Not mean, not playful, just weird. I called for her louder. After a few seconds, she crawled out from under the bed like it was the most normal thing in the world, smiled at me and said, "Go to sleep, sweetheart. Mommy's here." Then she left the room. The next night, same thing. I heard her crawl under right after lights out, the soft thud of her knees and hands against the floorboards, the shift of the mattress as she settled in, then the breathing. I was too little to really question it. I thought maybe it was just a game she liked to play, but the older I got, the more I realized it wasn't a game. It became a routine. She'd tuck me in like normal, turn off the light, and then she'd get under the bed every single night. And then she started doing little things. She would tap on the wood under my mattress in these odd rhythms. 3 taps, then 2, then 4. Sometimes it sounded almost like a song, other times like random patterns. If I moved or sat up, she'd stop until I lay back down. A couple times, I caught her peeking out from the foot of the bed. I'd feel eyes on me and look down, and there she was, her face just visible in the dark, one eye glinting in the faint light from the hall. No expression, just watching. I stopped sleeping well. I'd lie stiff under the covers, too afraid to move or call for her. If I tried to leave the bed, she'd grab my ankle. Not hard, just enough to stop me. Then she'd giggle again, that same soft, weird giggle. I never told anyone. How do you explain something like that when you're a kid? I figured no one would believe me. It wasn't every night that something scary happened. Some nights she'd just lie there quietly. I'd hear her whispering to herself sometimes, words I couldn't make out, soft and steady, like she was talking to someone I couldn't hear. This went on for years. During the day, she was totally normal, made my lunch, helped with homework, joked with me, hugged me. I remember trying to work up the courage to ask her about it once, when I was around 10. I said something dumb, like, "Mom, why do you sleep under my bed?" She just blinked at me and smiled. "Oh, buddy, I don't do that. You must be having silly dreams." But that night, she was there again, and the tapping was louder. By the time I was 9 or 10, I stopped looking under the bed. I started sleeping on the couch when I could get away with it. Eventually, when I turned 11, she told me I was old enough to have a lock on my door. She never came back into my room. I don't know why she did it. I don't know what changed. She passed away when I was 23, cancer. In her last weeks, she was confused a lot of the time, drifting in and out. But one night, when I was sitting by her bed, she grabbed my wrist and said very clearly, "I kept you safe, you know. You were never alone at night." I still don't understand what she meant. Before we continue, do us a quick favor, smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. I lived in a small Georgia town during my adolescence. One night, I snuck out of my parents' house to smoke a cigarette in the backyard at around 3 o'clock in the morning. I walked a few meters off the back porch into the dark yard. There were no neighbors and no nearby light sources except my phone flashlight and the glow of the cigarette ember. I began hearing a whistling sound out in the distance. It wasn't the wind or an animal. This was a clear, deliberate whistle. Imagine the kind of sound someone makes when trying to get the attention of their dog, alternating unpredictably from low to high pitch and back again. The length of each whistle also varied. Once or twice would have been fine, but this sound kept going and the source was moving closer, sometimes from left to right, over the course of several minutes. Each time I shone my flashlight in the direction of the sound, the whistle stopped. I almost lost my mind when I heard it less than 10 feet from me. That was it. I bolted inside. I never heard anything like that again, and I hope I never do. My friend has an elderly neighbor with dementia who lives alone in a creepy little cottage. One day, as I was entering my friend's house while he wasn't home, I heard the sound of words being spoken behind a glass window, about 15 feet away. I looked up toward the source of the sound and saw the woman peeking through the blinds, repeating a mantra, "I see you, I know what you're doing." She said it over and over again. I bolted inside the house and didn't come out until I was sure she was gone. Story 3. Back when I was learning to ride a bike, probably around 1980, I had a typical little kid's two-wheel bike with training wheels. One night, I left it at the neighbor's house. It wasn't a big deal since I could see it from my window, and it was still there when I went to bed. We lived in a suburban neighborhood where the houses were very close together. Just to give a sense of the time, this was when kids still played cowboys and Indians, dressed up as Native Americans for Halloween, and watched The Lone Ranger. That night, I dreamed that a Native American, in full headdress, face paint, and moccasins, came into the neighbor's yard and broke the training wheels off my bike. When I went down to check the next morning, the training wheels were broken, not just removed, but shattered into pieces, just like in my dream. At the time, I don't think anyone was particularly freaked out, but it has stayed with me as a vivid memory for almost 50 years. The happy ending is that I never got new training wheels and learned to ride without them. Story 4. My mom had passed several months earlier. One night, I woke up around 3 o'clock in the morning to find the living room lights on and the TV at full volume. I walked out of my room and saw my mom sitting in my rocker swivel chair, knitting with her back to me, the TV blaring and all the lights on. I turned to look at the clock. It was 3:44 a.m. When I looked back, the room was dark, the TV was off, and no one was in the chair. Only an Afghan my mom had knitted for me. I completely lost it. After my grandfather passed, my grandmother was sitting at her sewing machine when she heard him call to her from his chair, saying, "It's getting late, you need to go on to bed." She answered, "I just want to finish this seam," and then realized what she was saying. When she turned all the way around, he was gone. The same kind of thing happened to me. A few days after my dad passed away, I woke up one morning because I heard him call me, asking me to make him coffee, which was a pretty normal thing for us. I got up, went to the kitchen, plugged in the coffee maker, and realized he wasn't in his chair. I unplugged the coffee maker and went back to bed. My mother had a similar experience. After my great-grandmother passed, she said she turned out the lights and went to bed, but when she looked down the hallway toward the living room, she saw the lamp on. She went back to turn it off, and on her way down the hall, she said she saw my great-grandmother sitting on the couch, clear as day. By the time she got into the living room, she was gone, with the lamp still on. My mom went to the doctor and asked if she was crazy. Story 5. Personally, I lean toward nothing, but I also realize probability doesn't work the way most people assume. A 40% chance doesn't mean it happens 2 out of every 5 times. It means that each time there's a 40% chance, unless the conditions change. So when I think about it, nothing only feels more likely because it seems simpler. But if I'm being strict, it technically has the same 1 in a million chance as any other explanation, unless I can completely rule out a possibility. Then weird things started happening when I was pregnant. My starting premise was that it was purely biological. The flood of hormones and the discomfort of morning sickness made it reasonable to think I might have dizzy spells or that my eyes might play tricks on me. But I would be lying if I said I didn't see or feel something. A reflection moving across a stainless steel fridge as though someone were walking past, even though nobody else was home. A sudden cold coming from an interior doorway where chills didn't make sense, and things subtly shifting behind me while I worked at my desk. And my male cats weren't pregnant, but they seemed to see something too. They would react to the same shadows or growl down the hallway. My oldest cat practically lived as my sentry until we moved from that condo later in my pregnancy. But cats are known to have strong reactions when a human they're bonded to is pregnant. They get clingy and defensive without any ghosts involved, just as a matter of course. So nothing stayed in the dataset. We moved into a cute little mid-century house in a charming neighborhood. All seemed well. No more shadows or cold spots, and the baby arrived as expected. When she came, sleep naturally became a challenge in the house. My husband and I coped by taking shifts, where one of us would watch over our daughter downstairs while the other got some sleep on the main floor. We had set up a basement nursery for her, and the parent on shift would usually make a little nest in the basement den. Not long into our shift system, I had to rearrange the furniture because I couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing at the base of the stairs, watching me the entire time I was down there. Then there was the sudden dread, the certainty that the same thing had entered the room with my baby and I needed to go to her. But postpartum is hard, and the hormones are intense, so it still made sense that it could be nothing. Only our pest control technician, after getting to know him a bit, admitted to me that he also finds something about our basement unsettling and tries to get out as quickly as he can. Our daughter started sleeping better. We ended the shifts, and our lives moved back upstairs. As she grew and began interacting with her world, the staring began. There always seemed to be something just off to the side, in the doorway across the hall, that completely captivated her. As she got older and learned more, the staring turned into smiling, then babbling, then waving. She seemed to be fully interacting with something either behind me or across the hall, far more often than I was comfortable with, especially after everything that had already happened. But babies are going to be babies, and I wasn't ready to let go of anything. I had a hard time with phantom crying when I was trying to fall asleep, thinking I could hear my daughter just as I drifted off. To help, we got a very fancy baby monitor with sound and motion detection that ran on a fully closed system restricted to our Wi-Fi, but it went off constantly. It was registering motion non-stop, sometimes as many as 3 alerts per minute, even when I could see on the screen that my daughter wasn't moving. We adjusted the sensitivity levels, lowering them so much at one point that the monitor no longer picked up her actual movements, but the alerts kept coming. We moved the camera, changed the angle, tweaked every setting, and even got a new monitor receiver, assuming the first one was defective. Nothing made a difference. We eventually just turned off the motion alerts once we got out of the SIDS window. I also learned to turn the monitor off whenever my daughter isn't in her room, because it didn't help with the phantom cries either, and I disliked hearing them even louder through the monitor. Even now, my daughter still seems to interact with someone, though a little less, thankfully. Toys still sometimes go off in the box on their own, and a piano mat will respond to steps we didn't take, things like that. I still don't like the basement, but laundry has to get done, so I just make it quick. I still don't know what it is, but at least my probability set has gotten a little smaller, because it certainly isn't nothing. Story 6. I have a brother who is 8 years older than me. My mom used to talk about a creepy, grinning version of him that she and a babysitter saw when he was little. It seemed to age along with him, and my mom saw it multiple times. The babysitter saw it once and completely freaked out. I saw it myself when I was in high school. My brother worked multiple jobs and was gone a lot. To help him out and make some extra cash, I would clean his room and do his laundry each week. I usually stayed up late on Saturday nights watching Mad TV and SNL while folding laundry. I started feeling like I was being watched, even though my brother was at work and everyone else was asleep. When I turned to look, there was my brother peeking around the hallway wall at me with a super creepy grin on his face. All I could see were his hands gripping the wall and his head sticking out from the corner, but that grin was terrifying. I instantly thought he was messing with me, so I said something like, "Oh, go away," and looked back at the TV. Then I remembered he wasn't even home, and the hairs on my arms stood up. I looked back and he was gone. The next morning, I told my mom what I had seen, and she just nodded in understanding. It was almost as unsettling as the times I'd catch something out of the corner of my eye or hear something late at night and try to ignore it, only for my dog to start growling and stare in the same direction. Story 7. I had something going on for months that I still can't explain. I was living with my mom at the time and was probably 15 or 16 when it happened. I'd always loved horror movies and been interested in anything spiritual, but I never really felt like I truly believed anything could actually happen. At the time, I had a single bed pushed up against one corner of my bedroom. One night, I started seeing a girl appear as I was falling asleep. It would happen whenever I closed my eyes. I'd close them and see this girl kneeling in front of me at eye level. Her eyes were shut, but I still felt like I was being watched. This went on for about a week before I started feeling really uneasy. As I drifted further into sleep, the girl became less clear and seemed to move into the opposite corner of the room. I didn't physically get up or move, but I felt her presence grow more sinister and dark, and that corner of the room became pitch black even though it was opposite the window. I tried to tell my mom, but she didn't want to hear anything paranormal, so I kept it to myself and just got by on less sleep than usual. Then 2 really unsettling things happened. One day, a friend came over after school with me to grab something from my room. We were standing at my bedroom door when she suddenly started crying, really scared, panicked crying. She said, "There's something behind me," and of course I was like, "Excuse me?" I hadn't mentioned a single thing to her about what I'd been experiencing, but she told me she felt like something was standing right behind her, breathing down her neck. I stayed at her house that night and had friends over the following night to try to get myself over it. When I had my friends over, 2 of us topped and tailed in the bed. In the morning, I asked how she had slept. She said, "Fine, but I saw a girl in here, and it kept me awake for a while." She was completely unfazed. When I asked her to explain, she described exactly what I had been experiencing, down to the smallest detail. I basically crapped my pants right then. She then told me that if I was uncomfortable, I had to tell whatever spirit it was that I wasn't afraid and to leave me alone. That night, I FaceTimed whatever friend I could and shouted that I wasn't scared and to get out of my space and leave me in peace. I never experienced any discomfort in that room again. Story 8. I was sitting at home on my computer, listening to music with headphones on, when out of nowhere I saw my brother storm into the room, stomping angrily toward me. It was so sudden and unexpected that I actually screamed and threw off my headphones. I'd never screamed before. Immediately after that, 2 more versions of my brother stormed into the room through the front door, each one disappearing once they reached the middle of the room. About 5 minutes later, while I was still sitting there staring at the door, my actual brother walked in, storming into the room angrily. Apparently, he had been at a party and lost out to another guy over a girl he liked. This made him really angry because he had been talking to her for quite a while. He got in a cab and stayed mad about it the whole way home. I said to him, "Did you get mad about something at the party?" He asked how I knew, and I said, you were just here?" I told him the whole story, and it still freaks him out to this day. Story 9. My whole family is pretty spiritual, and there's one instance with my nana and one with my aunt. The first story with my nana wasn't necessarily creepy, but it was completely unexplainable. One day, she went to the hairdresser, and as she tried to leave, she found she couldn't force herself through the doorway. She turned around and asked another woman getting her hair done if she had recently had a miscarriage, which is obviously not something you ask a complete stranger. The woman said yes and began crying. My nana then told her that it was meant to happen, that all would be okay, and that her baby was in a good place. The woman cried even more and said that she had recently become homeless and was only getting her hair done with a voucher to make herself feel better. My nana then walked out and forgot the entire afternoon for about a month before telling people about this extraordinary thing that had happened, something her mind had completely erased for a while. Another story is that my aunt was at a party the night my great-granny passed. The lights flickered at the party and she said, "That's my granny sending me a sign she's passed." Everyone told her, no, don't be silly. She called the nursing home, and they said they had checked on her 10 minutes earlier, and she was alive and well. My aunt asked them to check again, and when they did, they found she had passed on. It's strange how some people can sense these things. She wasn't on death's door, she was perfectly healthy, and her passing wasn't exactly a surprise, but it also wasn't expected either. Story 10. When I was around 4 years old, I remember looking out of my bedroom window and seeing cars driving through our side yard. Instead of looking like our yard, it looked like an actual road, and the cars were old-fashioned, like something from the 1940s. Our house was in a plan of homes with fairly large lots, and the through street ran in a completely different area. Naturally, I was frightened by what I saw and ran to tell my mother and older sister. They dismissed it and said I was either dreaming or making things up. I can't really blame them for that. My sister would occasionally tease me about it over the years, and for some reason, every time I was in that part of the yard, I would get a creepy feeling that I shouldn't be there. I must have been about 12 or 13 when my grandmother was visiting. She told my sister and me that when she was a young girl, our neighborhood had been part of a farm, and the main road used to run right through our side yard. The road was moved when the farm was broken up into housing lots. My sister and I looked at each other, and all I could say was, "Yes, I know." Years later, I found aerial photos and maps online that proved the road had been there until the 1940s. When we got our house, we did extensive remodeling inside. One of the things we did was cover up a doorway in one room and build a new door in a different location. All of this happened years before our daughter was born. When our daughter was born, that room became her room. One night, as we were putting her to sleep, she suddenly sat up in bed, pointed to where the old door used to be, and said, "Nobody walks through there anymore." There was no way she could have known there had been a doorway there, and we had never talked about it. When my brother was very young, he had an imaginary friend named Bill. When we were driving into town, he would point out Bill's house just inside the town limits. He said Bill had all sorts of tractors and farm equipment, and even stairs in his house. My parents used to brush it off, but once my grandma mentioned that Bill's house used to be a farm before the town grew and the land was sold off for housing, and that the house he pointed out was still the original farmhouse. A few years ago, I looked up the property and its past owners, and there was a William listed early on. Story 11. When I was in high school, my mom had a nightmare, and somehow we shared the experience. Our house was set up so that my bedroom was the first in the hallway, then my brother's room, the bathroom, the laundry room, and finally my mom's room at the very end. One night while we were all in bed, I heard my mom gasp from down the hallway but didn't think much of it at first. A few moments later, a shadow as tall as the doorframe walked past my door. I immediately got up, flicking on lights as I went, and asked if she had walked up the hallway. Of course she hadn't. She had been awake and saw it too. Together, we walked through the house, trying to figure out what had just happened. After we found nothing, I crawled into bed with my mom. She started telling me about the nightmare she'd just had. A tall man in a white tank top standing at the end of her bed, swinging an axe toward her. That was why she had gasped awake in the first place. As we lay there, still rattled, we suddenly heard and felt knocking on the footboard of her bed. We just stayed completely still, holding each other's hands in silence until it stopped. Finally, we asked each other if we'd heard it, and we both had. My brother slept through the entire thing, oblivious. Nothing else like that ever happened again, but it was one of the scariest nights of my life. Even now, I try not to stare at my doorway for too long at night, and I always keep fairy lights on so my room is never completely dark. Story 12. When I was little, I spent a lot of time at my great-aunt's house. It was the kind of place you could feel history in. Her grandparents had built it in the late 1800s, and everything about it was old. She called the living room the Davenport. The basement was a dirt floor cellar, and the walls were covered with huge, heavy frames holding photographs of long-past relatives. Many were posthumous portraits of babies or beloved family members who had died suddenly. I used to stare at those portraits all the time. One in particular fascinated me, a man with an elaborate mustache, a neat comb-over, foggy eyes, and a head that didn't sit quite straight on his neck. One day, while I was sitting there chatting with his picture, a sudden chill ran through me. I glanced over my shoulder, then looked back, and the man in the portrait blinked at me. I screamed for my great-aunt and told her what had happened. She just chuckled and said, "Ah yes, he's always been so lively, even after he passed." He never blinked at me again, but I swear the baby in the lace bonnet, another posthumous portrait, would subtly change too. Sometimes the lace sat neatly and perkily. Sometimes it folded down over the baby's face. It was never frightening energy, just lively ancestors who didn't seem quite gone. Story 13. I was about 17 years old. My dad's company had a beach house in Brookings, Oregon that senior employees could sign up to use for a few days or a week, free of charge. We headed there, and it was exactly as advertised. Beautiful and relaxing. One night, I decided to head out with a buddy I had brought along to explore and drive around town. We turned down a road and made it a couple of 100 feet in. For context, there were tall bushes on either side and trees forming a canopy over the road, creating a kind of tunnel effect. After we'd made it a little way down the road, the car's headlights just seemed to stop lighting anything. It was like we had driven up to a wall of black. No streetlights, no house lights, nothing at all. We eased forward a little more, but the headlights still ended abruptly at this curtain of darkness. They just wouldn't illuminate anything beyond or even around it. My buddy and I both got chills down our spines. It didn't feel right. We decided it wasn't worth exploring anymore, so we backed up, turned the car around, and left. The whole thing felt absolutely surreal, like the road ahead had been swallowed by nothingness. Here I am, more than 30 years later, and if you put a gun to my head, I'd say it was like someone had built a wall and painted it with Vanta black. Back then, though, I didn't know what to think. It was just eerie. We went back during the day the next morning, and it was a totally normal road. Nothing at all that could explain why. The night before, the road and everything beyond that point had simply ceased to exist in the headlights. I didn't investigate any further for the rest of the trip. I went home a few days later with a creepy story and plenty of skeptical looks from friends and family when my buddy and I told them about it. Story 14. I was about 9 years old when we were visiting my mom's parents and stayed overnight. That night, a storm rolled in, and the thunder woke me up. There was constant lightning, but between the flashes, I could see a strange greenish glow coming from the hallway. I got out of bed, and being clumsy, absolutely bashed my hip against a little table in the cluttered and unfamiliar room. I woke up the next morning with a huge bruise to prove it happened. I made my way to the hallway and realized the glow was coming from the room across the hall where my mom was sleeping. When I reached the doorway, I saw what was glowing. A giant, 3-foot-tall old woman's hand. From the wrist up, it wasn't moving, but it was slowly rotating, the whole thing like some kind of sculpture suspended in mid-air. My 9-year-old brain couldn't even begin to process what I was seeing. I just stood there gaping at it. Frozen in fear, I watched the thing slowly rotate, trying to take in the details. The skin looked paper-thin, veins winding their way up toward deep nail beds. The whole hand glowed with a faint, sickly luminescence. Not exactly see-through, but not solid either. Night vision is already grainy, but this thing was like double grainy, if that makes any sense, the only way I can describe it. Finally, my paralysis cracked, and I started hoarsely yelling for my mom. She woke up and called out to me. Her bed was across the room under the window, which meant I'd have to run past the thing to reach her. She didn't seem to see anything at all, just told me to come to her. So I gathered my courage and ran past it. She pulled me into bed and almost immediately went back to sleep. I kept staring at this giant thing invading my reality until I finally drifted off. The next morning, I woke up with a large bruise on my hip. My mother is convinced I was having a nightmare and remembers me waking her and climbing into bed but swears she saw nothing. I never figured out what it could have been, but it terrified me as a child. I've had something similar happen, and I believe it's just a strange dream state carrying over from sleep. One of mine happened as an adult about 2 years ago. I woke up and saw an ophananum, a biblically accurate angel made of wheels and eyes floating in silvery moonlight at the end of my bed. It wasn't sleep paralysis because I was up and moving around, not paralyzed. It also didn't make sense that this thing was in moonlight, since I had blackout curtains and the room should have been completely dark. It was a full-blown hallucination. I think sometimes our brains don't fully come out of dream mode upon waking, and we're left hallucinating while awake. Story 15. In April of 2015, I was up late working with a couple of other teams on a large implementation. I decided to take the dog out and grab a smoke while the other team finished their work. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning, so I didn't bother with a leash and just headed downstairs and outside. Once we were out, my dog went over to the grassy area in front of my apartment building and began her 5-minute ritual of picking the perfect spot. I grabbed a spot on the stairs and lit a cigarette. The grassy area my dog was scouring was brightly lit, but the rest of the neighborhood was nearly pitch black because there were no streetlights. It almost looked like a wall of darkness pressing against the edge of the street. I was sitting there watching my dog in the light when out of nowhere, I saw something move from the street onto the grass and slip behind a tree about 30 yards in front of her. She had her back to it, so she never saw it, and whatever it was made no sound at all as it moved. I figured my eyes were playing tricks on me and decided it was probably a good time to head back in and check on work. I got up and took a few steps toward my dog. It was around then that she went on the defensive. Her hackles rose, she started growling, and her whole body went completely rigid. When I caught up to her, she was locked on a tree in front of her, just staring and growling. It was the same tree I had seen something slip behind earlier. I tried to get her to follow me, respond to me, or even just look at me, but she was completely focused on that tree. At this point, I figured she was spazzing out over some perceived threat, something she had done before when she came across a new sign at the park that hadn't been there before. This time, though, I wasn't interested in letting her take another 5 minutes to figure it out before trying to make friends with it, especially since I knew she would first bark at it aggressively for a minute or two, and I didn't want to wake up the entire neighborhood. From there, I remember leaning down on one knee to talk to her in a soft voice. As I knelt, I glanced over at the tree and saw it. It was standing in front of the tree, about 10 feet tall. It resembled a man in shape, but was far too thin to hold any real organs. It was black from head to toe, and whether it was the way the light hit it or not, it looked almost like a two-dimensional stick figure that had jumped off a notebook page. No discernible features at all. I froze, and my dog went completely silent. For a second or two, it was just the three of us staring at each other. Then it took off, running, or more like gliding down the street, in the most peculiar way, almost like a cross-country skier in motion. It was strange and hard to describe. It made no sound as it ran, and a moment later it vanished into the darkness. My dog finally relaxed, and we headed back inside. Story 16. As a kid, various relatives used to take me on trips to the zoo, museums, amusement parks, and the movies. On one of these outings, my grandfather took us kids to the movies. This old movie house dated back to the days of live stage entertainment, vaudeville. Even though it hadn't been used in decades, the theater still had an orchestra pit, a relic from a time long after vaudeville had disappeared. I was following my grandfather in the area between the front row of seats and the orchestra pit when, out of curiosity, I peeked into the pit. There was no floor. I could see straight down into the basement. On the basement floor sat a large man-sized egg with a happy face painted on its shell. It had arms and legs and was lying on its back, flailing as if trying to stand up, but unable to because of its egg shape. I looked away at my grandfather for a moment, then glanced back into the orchestra pit. This time, the painted expression on the egg's face had changed. It now looked grief-stricken and frustrated. The eyes were closed and the mouth was twisted in a grimace. I looked away briefly and then back again. This time, the egg was gone, leaving only the bare basement floor. I looked away once more for just a few seconds, perhaps hoping to tell someone what I had seen. When I looked back again, the orchestra pit floor was fully there. I could no longer see into the basement. Only a small handful of wooden folding chairs sat on the floor, nothing else. As the years passed and I started going to the movies on my own, I sometimes returned to that very same theater. Every time I did, before the movie started, I would take a look into the orchestra pit. But I never saw anything like that again, just the plain, bare floor of the pit, without even the wooden folding chairs. That old theater is now gone, a typical casualty of the expansion of home video and cable television. Story 17. When I was 11 or 12, my mother developed a condition that caused swelling around her throat, which had to be drained by a doctor. The house we lived in had a master bedroom in the back northwest corner, while my bedroom was on the completely opposite side, with a den, kitchen, living room, and hallway in between. One night, I woke up panicked and knew I had to go to my mother. Now, my mother was a volatile and toxic woman, and I would never have dared enter her bedroom without permission. But that night, I was drawn to her. When I reached her side of the bed, I started shaking her and yelling for her to wake up. Her eyes opened, and she began clawing at her throat, unable to speak and barely able to breathe. I woke my father, and he rushed her to the emergency room. Her throat had swollen so much that she would have died if I hadn't woken her. I couldn't have heard anything from her room while I was asleep. Both bedroom doors were closed, yet something compelled me to go to her. Story 18. I was on a walk in the forest, as I did most days, when I suddenly had a powerful feeling that something was really wrong. Yet everything around me looked completely normal. Trusting the feeling, I moved quietly, slipping off the path at one point to peer deeper into the woods. After about 5 minutes, I came across a simple ring-shaped wooden structure. I stayed at a distance, studying it and wondering what it was and why it was there. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a leg in the background. A huge, creepy man was hiding behind some trees. I realized I had only spotted him because of that strong feeling, which had led me off the path and kept me watching the structure for a while. The wooden structure was directly between us that day, forming a straight line. He was clearly waiting for something. It was already late, with dusk approaching, and this forest is popular with women who walk there alone. I'm sure he was planning something bad. There had been at least 2 cases of SA there that same year. So I spoke to him. He was shocked that someone had discovered him and quickly left without a word, heading off in the opposite direction while hiding his face. I'm convinced he was a dangerous man, but I still don't know where that strong feeling of something is really wrong here came from, or why those wooden structures are built exactly in that place. Story 19. I was in maybe 1st or 2nd grade, sometime in the 2010s. My class went on a field trip to the local History and Science Museum, which had an exhibit on ancient Egypt, including the mummy of what appeared to be a child on display in a glass case. I vividly remember sitting on the floor with the rest of my class, listening to the curator talk about the mummy and what they knew, when I hallucinated the mummy fully sitting up in its case and turning to look at me. Then I blinked, and it was gone. I never had a hallucination like that again, but it scared the life out of me. Looking back, I think it was probably just the distress my child self felt at seeing a child mummy up close. I also briefly lived in a haunted house as a kid. I don't fully believe in ghosts, but we saw things there we truly couldn't explain. The most memorable incident happened around the time we were about to move out. We were sitting in the kitchen, my mom, her boyfriend, my sister and I, talking about something. A cereal box that had been sitting on top of the fridge suddenly flew across the room and hit the opposite wall near our heads, right by the dining room table. If it had simply fallen straight down, we could have said it was placed too close to the edge, but it didn't. It truly flew across the entire room like it had been thrown. It scared the life out of all of us. My mom and I still talk about that house in hushed tones because of how strange it was. Story 20. I was 11 years old, and my pet hamster, Peluso, had recently passed away from cancer. When he was healthy, I would close the door to my room, cover the space under it with a folded towel so he couldn't escape, and let him roam free on the floor. When he passed by the window, he would brush against the ceiling-to-floor fabric curtains, making them move. He would also shift light objects on the floor and make little noises as he explored. A couple of days after his passing, whenever I was in my room at night, the curtains would move, and little noises would pop up here and there as random light objects shifted on the floor. It lasted for about a week and then stopped. I always assumed it was Peluso bidding me farewell and playing with me one last time. About a month after those events, I was in my room watching TV. It was one of those 2-in-1 units with a CRT screen and a built-in VCR. The TV sat right in front of my bed, and I would sit at the foot of the bed to watch my Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network shows. I remember noticing movement in my peripheral vision to the left. It caught my attention, so I turned my head to look. There was something no larger than my fist floating in midair about a foot from me, sliding slowly but steadily from left to right. It had no clear shape or color, but you could tell it was there because the air distorted and turned visibly grainy around it. The closest visual comparison I can give is the shimmer of an asphalt road on a really hot day, that kind of visual heat. At first, I didn't react because it was so strange I could barely make sense of it. The floating hot spot moved from left to right in front of me, but when it reached the TV, it began casting a shadow inside the CRT screen. That somehow made it feel real, so I did what any kid would do. I ran out of the room screaming. I'm in my mid-30s now, and it's still the weirdest thing I've ever seen. I like to think it was Peluso once again. After all, the floating thing was about hamster-sized. Story 21. I live in a decently sized city in western Indiana, surrounded by farmland. One evening, as the sun began to set, my brother and I were driving back home on the southern side of town, where the outlet shopping areas give way to cornfields. It had grown just dark enough for the car headlights to switch on, but you could still see the scenery fairly well. As we approached the crossroad where we lived and started to turn right, the headlights illuminated a tall humanoid creature that looked like a deer running on its hind legs, sprinting away into the cornfield. The stalks were only about shin height at the time, so I was able to see it clearly for maybe 2 or 3 seconds before it vanished. Judging by the distance it covered across the field in that brief time, it had to have been moving faster than any regular person could run. I was immediately unsettled by what I had seen, but thinking it might have been some sort of trick of the light, I stayed quiet. My brother, however, confirmed my fears by asking if I had just witnessed what he had. Every time I see that field, I'm reminded of whatever it was. The worst part is knowing that it had been less than a few hundred feet from my house. Story 22. When I was a young child, probably around 5 years old, my family lived in a house shaped like the capital letter E. At the bottom of the long vertical bar was the front door. The bottom horizontal bar held my parents' bedroom. The middle was the kids' room. There were 3 of us, and the top was the kitchen. That part of the house extended farther, ending with the back door at the other end. On the back wall of the kids' room was a small vent that connected the room to the kitchen. Sometimes we would climb onto a chair to peek through it and see what was being made for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. It was great because the smell of food cooking would drift through the vent into our room, making us hungry. One day, I was home alone with my dad. He was in the living room watching TV, and I was in the kids' room doing kid stuff, playing with toys and looking at picture books, when I suddenly heard voices and noise coming from the kitchen. Curious, I climbed onto a chair and peeked through the vent. Through it, I could see our nanny preparing food. Wanting to know what she was making, I hopped down, walked out of the room, and turned into the kitchen. But no one was there. Nothing was being cooked, nothing was being prepared, just an empty kitchen. Confused, I went back to the kids' room and peered through the vent again. Once more, I could see, hear, and even smell our nanny preparing and cooking food. I remember calling out through the vent, but no one reacted. I went back out to the kitchen again, and again, nothing. I did it one more time, thinking I must have missed something. But when I walked in and saw no one again, my dad called out and asked what I was doing. I just shrugged. Then he asked if I wanted popsicles, and that was that. Shortly afterward, my parents got divorced, and we moved away from that house. My siblings and I still call it the weird house because it was shaped so weirdly. Story 23. 27 years ago, I was 13 and on a trip to Ireland with my family and my brother's Irish football league. They were playing somewhere in County Mayo or Sligo. We were about a week into the trip, and by then the matches were getting boring to watch. They were absolute bloodbaths. I wandered into the field next to the pitch and sat on an old wall that kept a bull away from the cows. A girl of about 10 and a boy around my age were there, doing the same. We sat, chatted, climbed a small tree, and played around like kids that age do. Later, on the way back to the B&B, my mom asked what I had been doing on the wall and in the field. I told her about the other kids and what we had been doing. She looked completely confused and said there had been absolutely no other children with me. She had checked on me multiple times, worried that I might end up in the pen with the bull while feeding clumps of pulled-up grass to a cow next to the fence. This wasn't the first time I'd unsettled my mom on that trip. Earlier, we had visited 2 different towns where I was able to describe and then actually find little pubs and churches tucked away, places I shouldn't have known existed. I also remember hearing singing in the Burren, faint and melodic, with no one visible nearby. Needless to say, my mom refuses to return to Ireland with me. That trip remains the only experience of its kind I've ever had. I'm not much of a believer in anything supernatural, but to this day I still can't explain or fully understand the feelings I had in certain parts of the country. Story 24. I was in college, driving far too fast, the wrong way down a one-way street. For some reason, I suddenly slammed the brake pedal to the floor, as if I were standing on it. That was the first and last time in my life I ever did something like that for no reason at all. As soon as I stopped, a toddler appeared, walking into the middle of the street from between 2 parked cars, about 5 or 6 cars ahead. At one time, I worked for a federal government agency. It was not the CIA, the NSA, or any other intelligence organization. Our team consisted of about 15 or 20 people who traveled internationally together. We traveled constantly. Most years, we spent roughly 60% of our nights in hotel rooms in foreign countries. Everyone had different responsibilities, and because of the frequency of our travel, we had a military plane assigned to us. We would simply go to Andrews Air Force Base, climb the stairs, board the plane, and take our seats. Although I was young, the constant travel eventually became too much. I was sick all the time, and too thin from not eating enough. It was an intense job. After a couple of years, even a really exciting job can feel mundane, so I resigned. 3 months later, that very plane, along with all my former colleagues and my replacement, crashed in Croatia. It was an incredibly strange feeling. Story 25. I've seen shadow people before. I remember once walking home between a church and a dip in the ground between the church and another property. I saw a shadow figure creeping toward me. At first, I thought it was my own shadow, but then I noticed its feet were actually touching the ground. Usually, shadows start at your own feet from where you're standing. Another time, in the early 2010s, little me woke up and saw my stuffed lion with an evil look on its face, staring at me. The next morning, its face looked normal again. I know what I saw, And another time, I was downstairs watching a horror film on Halloween. It was around 12:30 in the morning when I looked upstairs and saw something black just above the kitchen table. It looked at me for a split second before vanishing. Another story, which did not happen to me, but to my parents. They claimed to have seen 5-year-old me in their bedroom with my back turned to them. They asked how I got into their room, but I gave no response. My dad flipped on the light after asking my name again, but still there was no answer. When he turned on the light, I was gone. Whatever they saw, it wasn't me. Another story, I believe, happened to my aunt's brother, who claimed to have seen a demon in the mirror. The only proof was that he supposedly went insane, and I think he either passed away or took his own life. I was nearly abducted once at a grocery store when I was 7. I was also stalked by an older woman online when I was 16, and that went on for about 5 months. Story 26. My ex-wife and I threw a party and invited a few different friend groups. At one point, 2 roommates started talking about how they believed their attic was haunted and wanted to use a Ouija board, but their third roommate was against it. As the party wound down, they invited me, my wife, and a third friend, who, as far as I knew, they had only met that night, over to play Mario Kart and finish off the evening. Once we were there, they brought up the Ouija board again and decided to go for it since their other roommate was out. I didn't touch the board myself, but just watched. I didn't trust them. They were using it 2 people at a time. When the guys were on, nothing happened. But whenever my ex-wife was involved, they got answers, no matter who she was paired with. Many of the responses didn't seem to make sense at first, until I noticed and pointed out that the letters were jumbled, almost as if someone with dyslexia was spelling them out. Through the board, they gave a first name, said they were born in Canada, couldn't give an age but said they were young, and claimed they had passed away from SA. After that question about dying, the answers stopped making sense. They became random words followed by a repeating series of numbers. I told them to ask if it was still the girl, or something else. The board said it was the girl, but when asked again, it said it wasn't, and then it ignored all further questions, just continuing the numbers. I told them they should stop and explained how you're supposed to close a session. The people on the board said it was hard to say goodbye. After that, we drank more and played Mario Kart. The third roommate came home, saw the board in the attic, and got angry. Later that night, the board flew down the stairs. For it to do that, it would have had to move from the attic, around a corner to the staircase, and then around another landing. The third roommate came out of his room only after it hit the ground on the first floor. His room was at the far end of the hall, so if he had thrown it, he would have needed to get to his room in seconds, and then convincingly pretend to come out asking what had happened. I don't think it was faked by my ex-wife. She was genuinely upset and never wanted to talk about it again. The roommates could have planned it, but they hadn't even started the conversation with me or my ex-wife in the first place. And like I said, the third guy, who to my knowledge didn't know them, also wanted to sleep with my ex-wife, so I doubt he would try to scare her. Plus, I was the one who made the dyslexia connection and noticed that the person they were speaking to had changed. Either it was an incredible improv performance with no real motive beyond freaking us out, or it was something I simply can't explain. Story 27. My mom had a fatal heart attack at the dental office, where she and my dad had worked for over 20 years. In the weeks following her passing, I stepped in to help my dad. When my mom collapsed, she had been reaching for the phone in their back office. A few days after she passed, a call came into the office, and the caller ID displayed none other than my mom's name and number. I answered the phone literally shaking, and of course the voice on the other end was not my deceased mother's, but that of a longtime patient who had been coming to my parents since my dad first started. She was confused because I was stumbling over my words, and I had to explain to her what had happened with the caller ID. I apologized, saying maybe the phone had glitched, but it didn't just happen once. It continued for about 2 weeks after she passed. Then, around the time I stopped going into the office, the caller ID issue simply stopped. Even now, it still freaks me out to think about it. Story 28. A few years ago, at the apartments where I still live, my wife and I were walking out our back door toward a grassy area with a basketball court. We saw someone walking their dog in the direction we were headed, so we hung back a bit to give them space. They walked through the grass toward the chain-link fence that separates the property from the city sidewalk. As we started walking the same way, we saw them somehow pass straight through the fence and end up on the sidewalk. I turned to my wife and said, "We've been here for years. How did we not know there's a gate there?" We headed toward the spot ourselves, only to find no gate at all. I thought maybe there was an opening they'd slipped through, but there wasn't. No gate, no opening, no way to get to the sidewalk except by hopping over. We'd been watching the person the whole time and they never broke their stride. Completely baffled, we just stood there and watched as they walked up the sidewalk, wondering what we'd just seen. It wasn't anything terrifying, but it still creeps us out enough that we talk about it from time to time. Story 29. My son was maybe 3 or 4 when I took him trick-or-treating. We were walking down a street in our neighborhood when I decided to turn around and snap a photo of him in his Halloween costume. As the flash went off, I suddenly heard a zapping sound, very much like the noise a microwave makes, but not a steady hum. It was more like something electric or energetic, connecting and disconnecting. I'm still trying my best to make sense of it, but even years later, I'm confused about what that sound or energy was, or how to describe it. When I checked the photo I had just snapped, it looked like a white branch or an outstretched arm was reaching toward my camera from the side. As it moved between my iPhone camera and my son, the camera refocused and both of them ended up blurry in the picture. I swear there was nothing there when I took the photo. If there had been, I wouldn't have snapped it. I know camera flashes can malfunction, but I have no idea how that would create a distinct white blob like that. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if what I saw was connected to something that allegedly happened on that street a while back. I remember people on Nextdoor talking about it. Unmarked police cars and coroner vans were coming and going for a while. I never found out exactly what happened, but I do remember one neighbor commenting that natural deaths don't usually lead to that much police activity. Story 30. As a kid, I was placed by CPS in a large foster home for several years. It wasn't very far from a forest with hiking paths, so we'd occasionally go there by car. One of the adults who supervised us was friendly and well-liked by most of the kids. Compared to some of the other adults, that made sense, but I never felt any attachment to them. One day, we went walking there with a younger kid, me, and 3 slightly older kids. The path split briefly into 2 options, one slightly easier and one a little harder. The older kids preferred the more challenging, interesting path, while the adult and the youngest kid chose the easier one. We knew we'd be out of sight for only a few minutes at most before the paths merged again. But when we reached the end of our path, there was no sign of them. We had a clear view far ahead, but they were nowhere to be seen. At first, we shrugged it off and waited a moment, then backtracked along their route. We looped back, called their names, and soon our nerves turned into full-blown panic. We were yelling like crazy, but there was no sight or sound of anyone else. The oldest boy suggested we head for the most visible spot in the forest, a river at its center where a massive log crossed over it, and call for help from there. It wasn't far, and from that spot we could be seen from every direction. We tried to reach the river carefully, but soon realized it was far more dangerous than we'd thought. The slope was steep, the river below was fast and turbulent, and every step felt risky. It took time and we started arguing. The oldest boy tried to push us forward as safely as possible until I broke down crying and couldn't go any farther. I was terrified of falling. It felt safer to climb back. Just then, a couple of hikers noticed us. They hadn't seen anyone else and didn't know what to do. This was before cell phones were common, so they simply showed us a way to get back to the main path and said they could call for help if we needed it. We climbed back up, crying and trembling, and when we were alone again, poof, the adult reappeared with the youngest child. He sneered, saying they were just hiding nearby, watching and laughing at us, panicking instantly for no reason, and insisted it had only been a few minutes at most. He called it a harmless prank, but to us it felt like something else entirely, like an unexplainable time warp. We were baffled and definitely not reassured, though the oldest boy still trusted that adult. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.